Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Daniel, and I'm the owner of the Creative Product Managers Group. Today we have an also guest presenting. I'd like to introduce you Kenton Kivestu. Kenton is the CEO and founder of RocketBlocks and have a wide experience launching products in very relevant companies. Feel free to make questions on the chat. He will answer all them at the end of the presentation. Let's welcome Kenton. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Kenton.
Thanks for having me. Okay, let me get my screen shared here. Can everyone see that? We good, Daniel?
Yeah, it's okay.
Awesome. So go ahead and get started. Thank you for showing up, and I'm excited to chat to you today about demystifying the PM interview. As Daniel mentioned, I've got a lot of product management experience from a variety of companies. I spent time at Google, Zynga, and Flurry, and I've also done a stint as a management consultant at BCG. And I'm excited to talk about this today. So let me sort of jump in and talk about what we're going to cover overall. Four big topics. The first is I'm going to start just for a tiny bit of time and talk about perspective, which is a little bit of context around how I view PM interviews and where my background sort of comes in and influences that. So you get a sense of sort of the context that I'm coming from. The second big thing we're going to talk about is the PM interview landscape, talk about sort of the defining characteristics of it, and lay the land. And then we're going to move into the third topic, which is how to approach the PM interview from a skills-based approach or perspective. And then lastly, we'll talk about a framework for preparing for the actual interviews using that type of approach. So those are the four things we're going to talk about today. And let's go ahead and jump in. So first, a little bit of background on my perspective. It is essentially shaped by my experience at three different technology companies. The first was Google, the second was Zynga, and the third was Flurry. And at Google, this was sort of my formative product experience. It's really where I learned how to build and launch products. I worked within the AdWords group, the Google advertising platform, and helped launch three different new advertising formats there. After Google, I spent time at Zynga, and I ended up running the mobile poker team there, which was a really fun team, a great product. And during my time with that team, we grew DAU, daily average users, from around 120,000 a day to about 2.5 million, and revenue from around $10,000 a day to $250,000 a day. The team also grew at the same time. After Zynga, I went to Flurry, sort of went back to my advertising roots, and I ran the ads product team there. We had a variety of different advertising products: a mobile video ad network, a mobile display network, and then a DSP, demand side platform, which myself and my team sort of built up from scratch. And eventually, Flurry was acquired by Yahoo. These are sort of the companies that my product management experience has been formed at. I think importantly, one of the reasons why I share some of my background as well, especially starting at Google, is because I don't have a lot of the traditional credentials that product managers at a place like Google have. I did not go to a school like Harvard or Stanford or MIT, and I was not a computer science undergrad or an engineering degree holder of any type. And I think a lot of people think that those are certain sort of prerequisites for breaking into product management. And so I share a little bit of my background in the fact that I don't have some of that, because I think when I was first trying to break into product management, I spent a lot of time trying to study what are the skills that actually matter in these roles, and how do they get tested so that I can prove that I can do the job, even if I don't have some of the credentials that some of these companies care about. And I think the good news is it's definitely possible to break in without those credentials. And I think more and more companies are realizing that those credentials are not the most important thing. So I think if anything, it's getting better rather than worse. But so that's my background. And let's go ahead and talk about the PM interview landscape. We'll cover a few things, sort of the range of PM interviews, why is there variance, and understand what some of the common skill sets that are tested are. So I think at a very high level, something that's really important to understand about product management interviews today is they are really in flux and they're evolving rapidly. So I think three key things that you can say is one, the style of interview that you can face varies widely. If you look at a big company like Amazon, they famously have 14 leadership principles, and they test those leadership principles in their interviews in sort of very specific ways. Google, on the other hand, has a large sort of like technical bias in who they like to hire for product managers, and they run interviews that tend to have more technical questions, and they try and suss that out. It's a different approach than what Amazon's doing. And then if you look at a third company like Facebook, they have a very entrepreneurial bent to who they hire for product managers. So they like to hire a lot of people that have maybe started their own startup before, even if it didn't work out, or were early employees at a startup and sort of know what that experience is like. Some companies use full product case interviews like Uber tends to, and companies like Google tend to do a more sort of scattershot series of questions and interviews. So there's a lot of variance in the style of interview that you might actually face when you're interviewing for product management roles. I think the second key thing to think about is that the company specific and sort of industry specific knowledge that you're expected to have also varies a lot. So if you think about a company like Google, they have hundreds, if not thousands of products. And so as a consequence of that, they do not expect that someone coming in for a product management interview is going to know everything about Gmail and Google Docs and Waymo and YouTube and Google Cloud, because it's just too much stuff. So to some extent, your knowledge around specific company stuff or industry stuff for Google can be a little more generalist. They still want to know that you have product skills, but it's more of a generalist approach. Whereas the smaller the company gets, so if you think about maybe a company like Airbnb, for example, they're not at Google scale, but they're not a small startup. They're probably going to care that you have some interest in the travel industry, hospitality, and that you've got some knowledge there. And then if you went to a super small startup, like maybe you're talking to a Series A startup or a Series B startup, maybe you're interviewing for like the first or second product manager role, those type of companies are usually going to expect that you've got a really sort of deep set of knowledge around their industry or their company, and that you really care about it, because they're not at the Google scale where they can just hire a generalist and you can sort of work on a bunch of different products over your career there. So that's the second big thing. And then the third thing to keep in mind is the best practices for PM interviews are still codifying. 20 years ago, the role of product management barely existed. There were certainly some product managers out there, but it was not like today where you have companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook that have literally thousands of product managers. And then on top of that, you have all this sort of traditional companies being companies outside of the technology vertical, like Starbucks or retailers like Home Depot, et cetera, that are building software these days. Like software is becoming critical in all sorts of businesses. And because they're building software, they need PMs as well. But the bottom line is that you have all these companies out there hiring product managers. The role is still relatively new in the general scheme of things. Like people have been hiring salespeople forever. People have been hiring marketers forever. They've been hiring general managers forever. But product management is still relatively new. And so the best practices are much less codified than, say, if you think about how a management consulting firm hires its consultants or an investment bank hires bankers. So over time, I think the best practices will become more codified, but it's something you've got to know as you're going into these interviews that they're not as set today. Now, the flip side of it is I think there is some good news. Even though the styles are very varied today, the best practices are still evolving, and the level of company-specific knowledge changes a lot. There are some really consistent things. So I've spoken to, I think it says 50 on the slide, I think it's over 80 now, product managers at Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, Stripe, Gusto, Lyft, Uber, Airbnb, like you name some big tech company, I've probably talked to a PM there, and ask them, when you are interviewing other PMs, what skills and what skill set areas are you looking for? What really matters when you're trying to hire folks? And the good news is there's basically like 6 areas that are consistently cited by product managers. So even though the interview framing varies, and whether it's a product case or whether it's a specific question, or whether the company is looking for more generalists or more specialists, like a lot of the same skills, the same core skills are there. And Satyajit Salgar, who's a group PM at Google and someone I used to work with, I think summed it up really nicely. And he said, learning how to be a good PM is a lifelong task, but like all things, there is a table stakes set of skills, and that's what PM interviews focus on. And I think what I really want to try and convey throughout this presentation is that thinking about the skills in particular and getting less caught up in how a particular company or interview tries to test those skills is a really important distinction when you're thinking about product management interviews and how to succeed in those interviews. So, what skills matter? If we really care about the skills, what are the skills that product manager, hiring managers are looking for? And I think there's really 6 that are the sort of key ones that show up repeatedly, regardless of the company and the focus that people are looking for. The first is product sense. And we're going to go into each of these in more detail, but I'll just touch on them quickly here. So product sense is, does this person have a good sense for like what a great product looks like? Do they have passion about building products, constructing them? Do they have sort of this, what some people call like a spidey sense, like a 6th sense about what a good product looks like? The second category is analytical skills. So they want to know that the candidate they're talking to will make logical, reasoned decisions, that this isn't going to be a person that they're going to put in charge of a product and he or she is just going to sort of shoot from the hip all the time and make a bunch of decisions that the rest of the team can't understand or sort of can't follow. So that's the second big thing. Third is technical fluency. At a high level, it really boils down to, will this person be able to work with engineers? At the end of the day, if you're a product manager and you're building and shipping software products, you need to be able to work effectively with your engineering team, regardless of whether you come from an engineering background or not. The fourth is execution. Again, so, in the software world, you're shipping software, and that second part, that second word, shipping, is sort of the key operative word there. If you can't execute and get stuff done, there's no way you're going to be able to ship the product and move it forward. And so that's a big part that is sort of pressed on in these interviews. And then the fifth, communication. If you have a ton of great ideas, but you're bad at articulating them and communicating them to others, that's typically a really big red flag and will reduce your efficacy as a PM. And then the last thing is culture fit. The companies want to know that the candidate sort of values the same skills and beliefs that the company does. And so they're always looking for that, regardless of whether it's something that's explicitly stated or not. So these are the 6 skills. We're going to spend some time focusing on them. Before we dive into the individual skills, I also want to mention that it's important to think about how each company indexes differently on skill sets. So for example, if you think about something like technical fluency, you can think about how companies care about this on a spectrum. A company like Google might be at one end of the spectrum, and they care a lot about how technical their product managers are. It's sort of ingrained in their culture. Google was founded by 2 engineers. Almost all the early employees were engineers, and it is part of the culture that the people working and shipping on product tend to be more technical. And so that's something that Google has just sort of codified in their process. On the flip side, you might have a company like Airbnb that's founded by designers. They still build and launch products, but they come at it from a different approach. In fact, early product managers at Airbnb were actually not called product managers. They were called producers, because from the sort of design and maybe gaming world that some of the early employees came from, those were the terms that were used. But regardless, Airbnb runs product management interviews that are a lot less technical than Google interviews. It doesn't mean that Airbnb isn't in some ways looking to assess whether the product management team will be able to work effectively with engineering, but the sort of scale of how much they're going to test for that varies. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. So let's jump in and talk about these skills specifically. And so what we're going to do in this next section is I'm going to talk about sort of a skills-based approach. And what I want us to think about and go through is look at different types of questions or product cases that come up in product management interviews and think about them from this skill-based lens and try and dissect what the interviewer is actually thinking about, what they're looking for in each of those. So since we've got limited time, we're going to focus on 4 of these skill sets that we were talking about today. So we're going to leave off communication and culture fit because those tend to be a little more universal in the sense like what it means to communicate well in a, say, consulting interview or a banking interview or a product management interview or just any sort of interview to some extent is similar to what it means to communicate well in a product management interview. But the 4 things I do want to focus on are product sense, analytical skills, technical fluency, and execution. And for each of these areas, what we're going to do is we're going to look at one question that is designed to test how a candidate is performing in one of these areas and how, what their skill sets are in those areas, and talk about what type of stuff is going on. What is the interviewer actually thinking about? What are they looking for when they ask one of these questions? And how are they trying to assess whether the candidate really has this skill set or not? So I'm going to start and we're going to jump in and talk about product sense first. So what I'm going to do is we'll read through this sample question and then we'll talk through what is the interviewer thinking about after they present a question like this. So this is a product sense question, pretty typical one that gets used at companies like Uber and Lyft, and I think even Google occasionally uses something like this. But Uber wrestles with a big and ever-growing challenge: how to efficiently return lost items to riders. As a new PM on the Uber team, your director would like you to take the lead on designing a new lost items recovery system. How would you design and build this? So this is a pretty big, open-ended product sense question. It really forces a candidate to think about how are they going to design this sort of brand new feature set within the Uber app to meet this particular challenge that they're having. And when you get a question like this, what I want to focus on now is what is as you start answering this question as a candidate, what is the interviewer thinking? What are they evaluating you on, and how are they going to think about your product sets? So in this question, I think the first thing that interviewers are often looking for is can the candidate, can he or she structure a product problem? So that can they take this really sort of nebulous, big problem that's been presented, and can they create a sort of structured way to walk through and analyze this problem and create a good solution or feature set for it? And I think the reason that interviewers are really looking for that and they care about that is that as a product manager on the job, you are going to face these type of problems all day long. And they want to see that you have that you can sort of build a framework and that you can build a repeatable process for solving problems, and not that you just hear any particular problem and have like a random great idea off the top of your head, because maybe you had a good idea for this particular problem, but how do they know you're going to have a good idea for the next 1,000 problems you sort of face on the job? And so the first thing, because of that, is they want to see that you've got a structured approach to handling something like this, that you can lay out a handful of buckets that really matter of key issues that you want to look at, and then walk through those logically and talk through how you would, in this case, design a lost item recovery system. The second key thing the interviewers are looking for is whether the candidate can, traverse the spectrum. And what I mean by that is, as a product manager, on the job, you're going to have to spend a lot of time going between the very high level, like what is the vision for a product, what is the 20,000 foot view, and then go all the way across that down to detailed tactics, like which bug are we going to fix first? How are we going to prioritize these 3 features that everyone wants, but we've only got time to build, 2 of them in the next quarter? These are sort of the very tactical things, or like, where are we going to put this button on the screen? What color should it be? Where should it go? Like, there's a lot of tactical stuff that's going to come up that's very different than the strategic stuff. And oftentimes candidates will get stuck at one end of the spectrum. They'll spend a lot of time talking about the vision, the high level motivation for a product, but then be unable to describe tactically how it's going to come together. Or sometimes you have candidates that are on the flip side. They're really good at talking about the tactics. They can talk about the specific UX flow, where this button goes, or which feature they might build first, but they sort of lose track of the overall, what is the vision for the product? What are you trying to solve? How does it fit into the overall company, et cetera? So that's the second big thing. The third is, how does the candidate think about leveraging the existing technical assets the company has? I think especially when you're interviewing at the bigger tech companies, places like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, even companies like Uber, Airbnb at this point, these companies have massive user bases. They have proprietary technical assets that they've built up. And companies want to see that you can smartly think about how can you use those assets as you're building new products within a company, and how can you leverage those to create a really good sort of unique experience from a product perspective that would also be tough for its competitors to replicate. Then the final thing here that I think is critical is that interviewers are looking for, again, what I would call this spidey sense about product. They want to know that the potential product manager has like some deep insight about products. Like, they think about them a lot. They have some specific sort of like passion and interest and get excited about it, because this is often what product managers think about, the fun part of the job. Like, designing the products is the great sort of fun part. So if a candidate is sort of struggling to demonstrate any interest or doesn't even seem excited to work on these type of problems, it's often something a product manager will think, well, how are they going to be on the job when they only get to do sort of 10% of this fun stuff, and then the rest of the work is bug triaging and digging through numbers to analyze funnels, et cetera. And so to sort of sum it up here, they want to see that you've got some like sixth sense about product and that you really enjoy applying that to the questions you're wrestling with. Okay, so let's move on to the second skill set. And the sample question we've got here is, I'll read it out quickly. You're a lead product manager for the Android app of a leading media company. You walk in the morning, check your main metrics dashboard, and find that daily average users, DAU, is down 9.7% week over week. How would you investigate this issue, and what key items would you look at? And so we've got this chart here of DAU, and we see that it takes a big nosedive in the period that is shaded yellow on the right side of the chart. So this is a pretty typical analytical question that you might face. And let's talk about what the interviewer is going to be looking for as you're working through it. So I think one of the first things right off the bat is they want to know that the candidate can start thinking about the right questions to ask. At tech companies these days, the challenge that folks in the product manager role often have is that they're drowning in data. There's so much data that they have access to, logs, their analytics dashboards, various events they're tracking. And the risk is that PMs get caught up in analysis paralysis. They want to boil the ocean. They want to look at everything. And so one of the first key questions is, given any particular analytical situation, does the candidate have a good sense of, okay, like if this is going on, I want to look at X. X and Y and Z seem like the most likely issues to dig into if we're experiencing a drop in DAU. So they want to see that you've got some intuition and some sense of what are the right questions and areas to start looking, rather than just you're going to blanket analyze everything until you stumble across the right answer. The second key thing sort of related to the right questions is, can the candidate really define the metrics that matter? And so what I mean by this is, in the question that we're talking here, where you see a DAU drop and you're trying to investigate, okay, what's really going on? Why is DAU down week over week? Maybe given that this is a media company and they're probably pushing out new, news and content on a weekly basis and sending something like push notifications with it, you might say, oh, okay, like the thing I want to look into, one of the things I want to look into is what's going on with push notifications. And the interviewer might say, oh yeah, great, that's a good idea. We should look into what's going on with push notifications. So that would satisfy that first question. Person knows the right questions to ask. But if you just said, I want to look into push notifications, how would you actually do that tactically at a company? Like, you want to be able to specify exactly what you'd want to look at. So you might say, I'm interested in looking at average push notifications sent to a user, charted out daily for the same days we're looking at that DAU chart. And really what I want to see is if push notifications fell off a cliff the same day DAU did. If those two are correlated, then it seems like we should dig in there more, because maybe what's going on is DAU has dropped because we're sending less push notifications. So in that second question there, can the candidate define the metrics that matter? It's really good to be able to get down to the point where you can talk about like the actual metric, the numerator and denominator of something you're going to look at to help investigate what's going on. And the third piece related to that is, does the candidate feel strong enough that they could work with or instruct an engineer on what sort of pieces of data to log? Are they sort of comfortable thinking in that fashion about like, look, if we need to track X metric, this is the type of stuff that we need to actually log in the system so that we've got it recorded and then it can flow to this dashboard so that I can do this type of analysis. And then the fourth thing is, does the candidate seem capable and willing to sort of pull, retrieve and manipulate data him or herself? So rarely does this get directly tested in product management interviews. It's I would say extremely infrequent that someone is given a MySQL table with 1 million rows and asked to pull out some of the data. But it will come up where someone will ask, well, if you had a table with like X and Y columns, write some like pseudo SQL, or like tell me how you would actually get that information out. Or if you were having this problem but you didn't have any data, tell me about what pieces of data you would log and then how you'd be able to analyze the situation once you had that data. So you want to be comfortable describing that type of stuff, and the interviewer is going to be trying to assess whether it's something that you are proficient in or not. Okay. Third category, technical. So let's go through the question here first. You're a product manager at Stripe, a leading payment startup, which was recently valued at 20 billion. I think this has actually gone up to 30 billion since I initially wrote the slide a year ago. And Stripe's core product allows a developer to collect credit card info on their website or mobile app and process a charge. For each charge, the Stripe API responds with a JSON object. What do you think is included in that JSON object? So this is a technical question that you might face in a product management interview. It is not of the nature that requires you to write code, right? Like, this is not testing whether you can sit down and write Python or JavaScript or anything like that. But it is trying to suss out a candidate's ability to sort of think through a technical issue and the type of technical issue that they might discuss with their engineering team if they were working at that type of company. So again, let's put ourselves into the mindset of the interviewer and think about what they're looking for. Very first thing is, can this candidate communicate effectively with the engineering teams? Like, as this person starts talking about the issue, is like their communication clear? Is it easy to understand? Can they describe these technical topics proficiently? And the second one, which is related to that, is this person going to be able to earn the trust of their technical counterparts? When you think about these first two things, if you are a product manager launching software products and you can't communicate effectively with the engineering teams, it's going to really hamper your ability to gain the trust of technical counterparts. And that alone probably means that everything is going to grind to a halt on a team. Because if you're trying to sort of guide the product vision and help a team ship products, and you can't communicate effectively with the bulk of the folks on your team and earn their trust, that's going to be a big problem. So those are like right off the bat, probably the two key things, especially at companies that care a little bit less on the technical spectrum, like we were talking about earlier. Google might actually press further on technical questions, whereas someone like Airbnb might just be looking at, can they communicate effectively with engineering teams? Will the engineers sort of trust them? Companies that care a little bit more might probe into things like, does the candidate really understand the product implication of certain technical decisions? So they'll want to understand, like, hey, if an engineer said X, can this product manager easily sort of take that sort of technical information and understand what it means for a product down the line? So like if we chose to go with this database technology versus another database technology, what are the actual implications of that on the, the product that we're creating, and what use cases is going to either enable or restrict for our users down the line? And then finally, just sort of like a obvious thing on the technical front, but to some extent, they're looking for whether discussing technical topics will make the candidate anxious. Like if discussing these type of topics is an anxiety driver, it's a good sort of signal of whether the person is, a good fit for a role where they might have to do a lot of this type of, might have to have a lot of these type of conversations and interactions with the team. So they're just going to be seeing, does this person feel comfortable discussing these type of topics, even if they don't come from an engineering background, which I think a lot of product management candidates don't, and that's totally fine. But they do need some sort of what I tend to call technical fluency, an ability to really discuss these topics and dive into them, even if they're not writing the code. Okay, so those, sorry. I thought we were on number 4, we're on the 3rd. The 4th one that I want to cover is execution. So let me read the question here, and then we'll talk about the interviewer perspective. So execution, you're a PM working on the Facebook Messenger app, and your team discovers a bug that prevents messages with the fire emoji from being displayed to recipients. Engineering estimates that it can push a fix with a scheduled release in a week, or they can fix it tomorrow, but push the scheduled release back by an incremental week. So this is a question really about trade-offs, about when are you going to fix a particular bug that's going to come up, and what are the trade-offs of doing that, which is a pretty typical sort of product execution question. And again, let's talk about what's going to be inside the interviewer's head here. They're going to be understanding first and foremost, how does this person make operational trade-offs? So how do they frame the issue? And how are they thinking about, okay, well, if we take X path, here's the benefits of that versus the cons, and here's what we're trading off. So that's the first thing they're going to be looking for. Does this person have a way of thinking through this operational issue and thinking through the pros and cons of different approaches and making a decision? The second thing they're going to be looking at is basically just like, do they have some sort of capability for triaging issues? Do they have a way of saying, okay, like this is the issue that's happening, and here's why I think it's either not a big deal, or it's a huge deal, or maybe it's somewhere in the middle? Do they have some way of thinking about that and talking about it and pointing out, what type of either data or anecdotes they'd want to collect to sort of verify and validate any hypothesis they're talking about? Then the third thing is, does the candidate understand what I like to call sort of the mechanics of acting quickly? So in any given organization, there's various ways to sort of get things done. And what the interviewer is going to want to see is that not only does a candidate understand, how to triage the issues and make some trade-offs, but once they've sort of decided which way they want to go, do they sort of have a sense of how they would get things done in an organization? Like, okay, like if we've made this decision, I'd, rally up the engineering team, talk to the engineering manager, let, him or her know what direction we're going to go, and then have them, pause the engineering team on their current work and reprioritize this to get it in release, for the end of the day so we can get it on set. Like they want to know that you've got some sort of sense about how you would actually move that action forward once you made a decision. And then the last key thing that I want to highlight here, especially in execution questions, is interviewers want to see that the candidate is comfortable putting a stake in the ground and defending it. A lot of times in questions like this, where it's, well, you could do this or that, what are you going to do? Some candidates will get stuck in the trade-offs part of this question. They'll be like, well, the pros are doing this or this, and the cons are doing this, and they won't want to pick one way or the other. They'll just want to talk about the pros and cons sort of endlessly. And so at least, that person can talk about the trade-offs. That much becomes clear and is good. But at a certain point, especially as a product manager, you need to make a call. You need to decide what the team's going to do, which product you're going to build, which bug are you going to fix, et cetera. And because of that reality, interviewers want to see that in the interview itself as well. Can you, just put a stake in the ground after looking at all the data available to you, and then say, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is why, and move forward. So that's the last thing on execution. Okay. So those are the sort of deep dives into the 4 skill sets that I wanted to do. And now I want to take a step back and say, okay, if you're looking at interviews from this mindset and thinking about, approaching a product management interview from the set of, okay, there are these different skill sets, and this is, regardless of whether it's tested in a case or a series of questions, these are the skills to think about. Let's talk about how you can actually think about preparing for those type of interviews. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that practice makes perfect. And on this slide, there's an image of Kobe Bryant, the famous American basketball player who recently passed away. And I put him on this slide because I think he illustrates something really important to think about, which is that if you want to get really great at any of these skills, yes, there's innate ability involved, but at the end of the day, the people that end up being great at this stuff also practice a lot. And Kobe Bryant was a very good example of this. I put one particular quote from one of his coaches there on the left, but there is like a myriad of stories of sort of detailing his work ethic and how he was sort of constantly like out on the court 2 hours before the team practice even started, just practicing alone on certain skills. And I think that's an important model to keep in mind. I think it's a really powerful thing to see someone who is sort of one of the greatest people at his particular profession. And his mindset was still that he was always practicing to get better. Like it's not just automatic. It's not only an innate gift. And I think the other thing that is nice about basketball or sports here as an analogy is just like an interview, there's a bunch of different components that are involved. And so we've been talking about in a product management interview, there's product sense, there's technical fluency, there's analytical skills, there's execution. And it's similar in basketball. There's shooting 3-pointers like you have Kobe doing here. There's free throws, there's set plays, there's all these different skills that come together to make a good basketball player. And so I think the key first thing to remember is that you have to practice those skills. And the second key thing is that there are certain processes you can use to do targeted practice. And the number one thing that I always recommend is a skill building loop. And it's really simple. There's basically 3 parts. First is assess, the second is build, the third is test, and then you repeat that loop. So let me just sort of quickly walk through it. I think the first thing that you want to do as you're approaching these interviews is think about, which of these skill sets are you stronger or weaker at? And even something as simple as a binary flag like that about like, okay, I'm a former engineer, so I'm really comfortable with technical stuff. I'm strong there. But I'm, a lot weaker on product sense because I just haven't spent as much time thinking about that. So even that type of simple self-assessment can be really helpful, because then you can say, okay, rather than just going and doing like, a mock PM interview or reading a book about PM interviews, you can now say, I'm going to go do some targeted practice and work on one of the areas that I know I'm weakest. And that's the second step. So, if you decide you're weak in the product sense area, force yourself to do 1 product sense problem per day or 2 product sense problems per day, and go through the motions of presenting yourself with one of those problems like you might get in an interview and thinking through, okay, if I face that problem, here's the type of answer I would come up with. Here's what I think is important. Practice sort of going through those motions and articulating it. You'll find that doing that gets a lot easier the more you practice it. It's just a skill like anything else, and doing targeted practice to hone it will really, really help. And then the third part is you want to go test your skills occasionally. So you want to sit down with, a friend and do a mock interview, and have them ask you a question and then give you some feedback on how you're doing, and test yourself on those specific areas that you're trying to build. And you'll find like you'll start to see improvement, or you'll see areas that you still need help in, and then you just repeat the cycle. And then you do another assessment and you figure out, okay, here's where I am, here's where I made some progress, I still need some help on this bucket, and go through that loop again. So it's pretty straightforward, but it really does help, and it gives you a structured way of thinking about how to prepare for a product management interview, especially when you're going to have, as we talked about in the very beginning, all these different variables about, some interviews are going to be product case-based, some are just going to be a series of questions, some will be a little more focused on the company and their specific industry, and some will be more generalist. It gives you a way to sort of cut through a bunch of that chaos and approach the interview in a very sort of structured, logical manner. So that's the final part, the skill building loop. Thank you guys for taking some time and listening to the presentation on demystifying the product management interview. And I'm going to open it up for Q&A now. And before, the last thing I'll mention is there's also at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little promo for RocketBlocks with a discount. So if you're starting to think about actually getting into interview practice and how do I work on building and assessing skills, building, assessing, and testing skills, that's really where a platform like RocketBlocks comes into place, and we can help with that. So I will pause there and open it up for Q&A now. Okay, I'm just looking at these questions now. So Aditya asked, what are the different aspects of product management that I must know? I feel as a product manager, I've been more involved with technology, somewhat user experience for internal operations users. I'm curious to know how critical it is for me to know the financial aspects of product management and marketing work. So I'm not quite sure about the financial aspects of product management. If you mean like managing a P&L and things like that, I think as you get more senior in your career and you're interviewing for maybe like a director of product role at certain companies, they might care about that. But I think especially at sort of the individual contributor level, whether you're coming out of undergrad or maybe an MBA program or early sort of mid-career, in product management, it really is mostly focused on those core sort of 6 skill sets that I was talking about. So, really focus on like your product sense skills, your technical ability, analytical skills, execution, ability to get things done. I think if you can demonstrate that you can do all of that, that's sort of the foundation. And then, if you've got like a very specific role that's about like a PM position building internal financial dashboards for Uber, then they might care a little more about that, and you should think specifically about it. But in general, I don't think that's going to be something that comes up in your interviews. Let's see, next question. What are some of the most critical mistakes that a product manager should avoid making in his or her career? I think one of the key things, and it sort of goes back to one of the skills that we were talking about, is jumping basically to a solution. So I think it's very easy as a product manager, someone presents a problem and it's easy to sort of think, you jump to the solution in your mind, like, oh, this is how we should fix that, versus actually going through a process where you say, okay, well, let's look at the data, let's understand the situation, let's hear some of the anecdotes from users about what's going on, let's think about the company goals, and then let's think about how to approach it. Because oftentimes, the first solution that pops into someone's head might not necessarily be the best. And so I think that's a common mistake you see, especially at the beginning of people's product management careers, is they sort of fall in love with a particular solution. And then even if they find information down the line that contradicts that, they sort of run with it. So this next question is how to answer the question related ethical dilemma. I'm not actually sure what that means. So if whoever wrote that in there, if you could comment on it and add some more color, maybe I'll return to that and see if I can answer it. Next one, what if you aren't able to come up with a creative answer in the product design interview? Creativity is a very subjective thing, and it may not spark in the interview. So I completely agree with that. And at the end of the day, like if you're struggling to come up with a super creative answer, like trying, like, forcing yourself to say like, oh, come up with something creative in your head is probably just going to stress you out more. What I would say in response is to actually like think of it differently. Like try and think about all the components of a problem. Like if you're going through a product sense problem and you're thinking about structuring it up front, like we were talking about, think about, okay, what is the actual user pain point here? What are the features that we could build to address it? Maybe how are competitors handling the same type of issue? What sort of unique technical capabilities does the company have that we could bring to bear on this problem? If you lay out a framework for yourself and then start thinking through all those issues, what you're going to find is that you may actually then sort of work your way into a very organic, targeted solution to that problem, which may turn out to be creative. Maybe it turns out to be a functional but boring answer to the problem as well. And I think that's fine. The goal is not necessarily to come up with the wackiest idea, but to have a sort of structured, logical process that lands you at a very effective answer to a particular, product sense or product design question. Okay, let's see. Next question from Paul here. And by the way, that last question was from Piyush. I'll try and call out the names as I go forward. This is a question from Paul. How do you answer questions about the best way to interact with the engineering team? I know you didn't really cover the communication aspect, but curious to hear your thoughts. I think that's a really good question. I actually have directly been asked that question before, like how do you interact with engineers? How do you motivate engineers? I think the first and foremost thing I would say is the number one thing is you should describe authentically what is your style of interacting with engineering teams, because every PM will have a slightly different approach. But I think a few of the things that matter and people want to hear is sort of, what is your style of engagement? Like, where do you like to engage with engineering teams? So one way of saying it might be like, certain product managers like to really focus on the high level vision and the roadmap and the core sort of product blocks that they want to construct. And then the way they want to interact with the engineering team is they want to then partner with, say, their engineering manager or engineering director and have he or she really build, go say, okay, like here's all the components we need to do what you're talking about. And like that's sort of how they're going to interact. It's going to be that type of model. Versus you might have another product manager that says like, I really like to sort of get into the weeds of the area we're working on. I like to talk and interact with the whole sort of engineering team and understand each of the individual components they're working on and the technical capabilities and the APIs they're working with, et cetera. And then some of my ideas are sort of going to bubble up for what we should do in the product and what's possible. And so they have a more bottoms up approach. So I think there's these different styles. different product managers have different styles of interacting with the engineering team. And so I think you want to figure out first is, how do you define your style of working with an engineering team? What does it look like? And then the last thing I'll say on this question is, I think this question often gets asked because certain engineering teams and engineers feel like they've been burned by PMs in the past that come and try and dictate everything. They treat the engineering team as basically just like factory workers that execute what they say on, or what the PM says. And typically that's a really bad arrangement. Like maybe it works in the short term, but typically the PMs and engineers need a more collaborative process to build a good product. And so I think that's one of the things that engineers are often looking and trying to suss out when they ask that question is this person going to just try and dictate everything to the engineering team? And as like another sort of ancillary flavor of that is this the type of product manager that's going to try and nitpick every technical decision? And I think product managers that come from an engineering background in particular tend to get that question, because other engineers have a fear that maybe like this PM is going to not be able to sort of let go of their engineering roots, and they're going to be want to be overly involved in micromanaging on a bunch of those aspects. Okay, next question. This is from Asui. It says, any other tips for assessing skill level that are more formal than a personal inventory? So two tips on that. So one, as we talked about sort of in the test stage, like sit down with a friend who's a product manager, or someone that's going through product management interviews as well. Or if you don't have anyone like that, even if you can find like an engineer that you've worked with in the past or someone that and run you through a product management interview question, and then ask them for feedback. Like say, okay, these are the 6 skills I want you to give me some feedback on. How do you think I did in these? And maybe certain people won't be qualified to comment on each, but certainly if you have like a friend who's a product manager, they should be able to comment on some of those. If you have a friend that's an engineer, they should be able to comment a little bit on your technical skills, and that can be a good way to do it. Another way that you can do it, and one of the reasons why we've built some of this, is on the RocketBlocks platform. We have drills in these different problem categories and these different skill set categories. And what it does is it lets you, you can get one of these questions that's testing a specific skill set. You can put in your answer, and then you can compare it to an expert answer from an expert product manager who came from either Amazon, Google, or Facebook. And you can see, okay, here's how this person, who's an experienced product manager at a big tech company, answered the same question. And you can sort of grade, okay, am I hitting on the same key issues that person did? So that's another way. I know it's a little bit of a plug of our own product, but I think that would help as well. Let's see. Next question down here. Could you please comment on this one is from Ken. Could you please comment on the approach of answering questions with how would I do something versus here's how I've done something? So let's see. Just trying to make sure I understand the question. So here's how I would do something versus here's how I've done something. I mean, I think both can be effective. To the extent you are asked a question where there's similar parallels between, how you've done something in the past, I would share some of those, especially if you think that you accomplished it in a particularly good way. There's also nice opportunities to blend those two approaches. Like if you're asked about, how you did something in the past, you can always, if it's a more behavioral question like that, you can always describe how you've done something, and then also talk about your learnings from going through that process and what you now know and how you would change it moving forward. So that's sort of like, here's how I did it, but here's how I would do it in the future now that I know X and Y. That might help. But I think, both, I think both approaches work. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. Let's see. So there's a question here from Ronnie, which is, how do you address upper management that don't have PM skills mentioned, but want you to address specific problems and your PM skills are in conflict with their thoughts? That's a good question. That's tough. I think that oftentimes dealing with upper management and executives at companies, showing a little bit of your thought process and how you arrived at a certain, say, decision for the product team or direction that you're going to go can be important. Because if you just sort of show up and say, okay, look, this is what we're doing, this is where the product team is going, this is what we're going to build, the execs that maybe have slightly different skill sets, maybe they're sales and they don't have a technical skill set, or maybe they're engineers and they have less of like the product sense skill set, they might be thinking in their head, well, like they never thought about X, Y, and Z. And so one way you can head that off is if you paint the context of where you're coming from first, and you say, look, okay, this is the situation the product team is dealing with. Like, here's the top feature requests we hear from the different teams. Here's what our customers say. Here's realistically the number of features we can build in a particular quarter. And like, here's the goals that we're striving against. Like, if you can paint some of that context and say, okay, here's the challenge we're dealing with. And then we took those inputs and based off X, Y, and Z in our prioritization, we ended up with Y. And that's why we're doing that. Giving some of that context about how you ended up at a particular direction can be really useful and help sort of clarify, even if the people you're addressing, like executives, don't have all the same PM skill sets you have. Let's see. Going through this list here to see if I missed any else. I don't think so. Any other questions that I should try and touch on before we wrap up here? Give it another like 20 seconds, and if not, I think we'll call it. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you guys really enjoyed the webinar. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn and send me additional questions if you have them. I love chatting about this stuff and I'm happy to help. And as Daniel mentioned here in the chat, there is an exclusive discount for the Creative Product Managers group. So 20% off your first month of RocketBlocks, and hopefully that will help you really get into top shape as you are preparing for your interview. So thank you again for watching, and have a great day, everyone.